As a sports fan, I have to confess. Sometimes the game gets kind of boring. That's when I unfold my Samsung Galaxy Z Fold 7 and use multi-window viewing on its large screen. Boring game? I'm checking out my fantasy baseball league at the same time. Score still 1-0? I'm replying to emails in the other window, scoring points with the boss. Semifinals finally getting exciting? I'm buying tickets to the finals and booking my flights. Can your phone do that?
The new Galaxy Z Fold 7. Get yours at Samsung.com.
Building a portfolio with Fidelity Basket Portfolios is kind of like making a sandwich. It's as simple as picking your stocks and ETFs, sort of like your meats and other toppings, and managing it as one big, juicy investment. Now that's pretty good. Learn more at fidelity.com/baskets. Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC. Member NYSE SIPC.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. My guest today is Deb Otis, Director of Research and Policy at FairVote. Now, as that title suggests, she is a data-driven person. I am too. I love that. And so I am really looking forward to talking with her today about what the data tells us about voting and voting reform. Deb Otis, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
So I thought before we got into the nitty-gritty, we could talk a little bit about FairVote, your organization. Could you say a little bit about what it's about and how long it's been doing, what it's been doing?
We are FairVote. We're a nonprofit, and we have been around since 1992, so just over 30 years now. We are an election reform organization, so we do research and also advocacy. Some of our priority issues are ranked choice voting and proportional representation. My role is the Director of Research and Policy, which means I'm on the number crunching side rather than the go out and win campaigns side. So a big part of my job is looking at how different election systems work in practice.
Okay. And a lot of the discussion around voting focuses on, especially on the left, focuses on reform. And of course, reform implies that, well, something is ill-formed or needs to be fixed in some way or deformed. And so obviously, I would say that's driving a lot of the work at FairVote. So what do you see as sort of the biggest problems with our voting system as it's currently constituted, at least most places?
Well, we see the symptoms everywhere. Voters are overwhelmingly saying that they feel like politicians don't care what they think, or they feel unrepresented, or they feel like their vote doesn't matter. And our whole system is supposed to be about representing the people and the consent of the governed. And here we are with folks saying the system is not working for me. And we're seeing those symptoms. The underlying problem is the system by which we're electing people. It's not that folks are unhappy with the candidates we get for no reason. The incentives in place are causing this hyperpolarization and inability of elected officials to act on the issues that people think are really important.
And I think some people might say, well, okay, but wouldn't this have been as true, say, 50 years ago as it is today? Because we have essentially the same basic kind of system. I mean, there are some places that, are doing mail-in voting that didn't and that sort of thing. But why is it now all of a sudden that our system that seemed to be working reasonably okay, at least by a lot of folks' standards, for quite some time, now is not up to snuff?
Well, I would argue there have been some problems all along, but you're right. It feels like it's more dire now. It feels like things are getting more polarized. And this is a global phenomenon. This is not just in the United States, but we're seeing things like fracturing of the parties becoming more extreme, voters feeling more disaffected. And in some countries around the world, it feels like these different forces are being kept in check a little bit better. But here in the US, we are really stuck in this two-party system where the parties seem to be just getting more and more extreme. And some of this is the parties are not local organizing forces as much as they used to be. And so parties are being driven by different factors.
And I think of the reform, you mentioned it already, but the reform that FairVote, at least to me, is best known for is ranked choice voting. And Politics Guys listeners are probably tired of me talking about how much I love RCV, but I'm going to try to be a little more critical here in this conversation. But before we get into the pros and cons of RCV, could you kind of give listeners who maybe aren't entirely familiar with how it works just a real quick overview of the process?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll say maybe folks in my life are also tired of hearing me talk about RCV. So I'm thrilled you and I get to nerd out about this today. So yes, basic overview. Ranked choice voting just means on the ballot, you get to rank candidates in order of preference. So you mark who's your first choice, who's your second choice, who's your third choice, and so on, if there are more candidates running. This has a lot of benefits, but the biggest one is that it's giving voters more power, giving voters more voice, and electing candidates who have majority support. Right now, we don't elect majority winners. If you ask folks, is it important that our elected officials got support from at least half of the people? Everyone says, well, yes, of course. That's what democracy should be about. Turns out our system does not currently do that. Ranked choice voting does that.
Now, there of course are instances in which pick one or plurality voting will give you a majority. Like, for instance, you could say in the presidential election, for instance, Donald Trump did win. Well, he didn't actually win the majority, did he? Actually, so okay, maybe I've actually proven your point here. But there are instances, right, in which our system does result in majority winners, especially when there are just two-party candidates basically running that are viable candidates. But I guess that gets into one of the potential advantages of ranked choice voting is it allows folks to express a preference for a minor party, a third party candidate without necessarily throwing away their vote.
Yeah, I think these choose one elections tend to work pretty well when you only have two candidates. You know, you pick the one you like best, whoever gets the most votes wins. And when you only had two candidates, by definition, whoever got the most has a majority. Great, easy. But as soon as a third candidate enters that race, then all of a sudden, who are they taking votes from? You know, if 20% of people go vote for that new candidate, which of the previous candidates are losing those votes? And did the entry of the new candidate, are they now changing who's winning? Did that person play kingmaker by choosing whether or not to enter the race? And this is why, you know, folks talk about strategic voting. People talk about voting for the lesser of two evils instead of the candidate they really like best. We kind of feel like even if you look at your ballot and there are 5 choices, maybe really it feels like you only have 2 choices. And that's hard for voters.
Yeah, when I would talk about this to students, I'd say, well, there's the throwing away your vote problem, and then there's even worse, what I call it, the electing your worst nightmare problem, which can happen as well in elections if you actually vote for the person you like the most. We saw that I think in the 2000 presidential election famously, where you could argue that progressive Nader voters gave us George W. Bush and other instances as well. And that's one of the reasons why I'm a fan of ranked choice voting, but probably the biggest reason. But to a lot of people, it seems really confusing. And not just in theory. I mean, there have been a number of studies that have found that ranked choice voting elections have a significantly higher percentage of what are sometimes called spoiled ballots, which means votes that, for various reasons, can't be counted. I saw one source that said in the 2022 Alaska election, which used RCV, the rate could have been as high as 11% compared to an average nationally of somewhere between like 0.5 to 1% spoiled ballots in sort of traditional just pick one elections. So I might be a little off on those numbers. I know that one Alaska number, that might be a bit high, but this seems like a reasonable objection. I wanted to get your take on it.
So I think those numbers are really inflated. I think I know the paper that you're quoting, and you're quoting it correctly, but they are counting ballots that counted. They counted as the voter intended for the voter's first choice. And this paper says, aha, spoiled ballot with an error. And so I would really question, how they're calculating those. Typically, if a ballot is spoiled and can't be counted, it means there was an error. Somebody, they voted for more candidates than they were allowed to. And so, you can't tell what the voter intended. Don't count that ballot. In a choose one election, that means you voted for 2 or more. In a ranked choice election, that means like for your first choice, maybe you marked 2 candidates as your first choice. That's typically what spoils a ballot. And look, the typical rate of that is 0.2%. So like 1/5 of 1%. And that was true in Alaska also. It comes out to like 400 ballots out of 250,000. So overall, the number is really low. I think something, folks kind of mix up what it maybe means to make an error. I think, I've seen a postcard from Maine where they use ranked choice voting that said, rank Donald Trump with all 5 of your votes. And it had a picture of a ballot in the Donald Trump line. It had filled in like first choice, second choice, third choice, fourth choice, and fifth choice for Trump. And that's not a spoiled ballot. Trump voter does that because a campaign told them to, and because that's the only candidate they want to support. And so if you're looking at a study that says that's an error, I think that's a misinterpretation of a voter's intention of just supporting their favorite candidate and avoiding ranking anyone else.
So in most systems, a ballot like that would in fact be counted as a vote for Trump, just to be clear?
In a ranked choice, no matter how many times you rank Trump, it counts as a vote for Trump.
Just want to be clear on that, right? Now,
it doesn't give you extra votes. If you ranked him twice or you ranked him 5 times, it's still 1 vote for Trump.
Right. Now, there's another issue, it's sometimes called ballot exhaustion. And so I was hoping you could explain that and talk a little bit about to what extent it might be more of an issue for ranked choice voting than for pick one.
Yeah. Ballot exhaustion happens if your top choice gets eliminated. That means your ballot will go count for your second choice. But if you did not rank any other candidates, then in the final round, the only candidate you ranked has been eliminated. Your vote does not count in that final runoff round. And that's called ballot exhaustion. It means your vote counted in the first round, but not the last round. And that does happen. That happens to about 10% of ballots. But we compare that to any other system, and that's a heck of a lot better than what we're doing now. Right now in our Choose One elections, if you don't vote for one of the 2 frontrunners, then your ballot does not count in that final contest between the 2 people who have a chance of winning, right? In ranked choice voting, at least you got a chance to rank a backup choice. You can have more power by saying, here's my real first choice, but if they don't make it, at least I do want to weigh in between the 2 finalists. I did a paper that found ranked choice makes 16% more votes count because these are ballots that didn't rank a frontrunner. So normally they would not weigh in between the finalists, but because of ranked choice, they had a backup choice.
Now, I've also read that these issues, confusion, ballot exhaustion, what have you, that they're not actually evenly distributed throughout the voting population. But what I mean is that in some of the studies I've seen, it's lower income, lower education, minority voters who have higher rates of confusion, ballot exhaustion, spoiled ballots. And if that's the case, well, I think that could be a big problem, particularly for folks like me on the left who care, a lot about disparate impact of various policies and so forth. And so can you speak to this? I mean, does RCV end up not counting for various reasons more votes from those groups than from other segments of the electorate?
We don't see any demographic impacts with ballot exhaustion. So, ballots staying in play to the final round. When you consider, all elections, you see, some races where some voters had their ballot exhausted and other races where it's other voters. But when it comes to ballot errors, so like an overvote, you ranked too many people as your first choice, we sometimes do see disparities there. They tend to mirror the same disparities you see in Choose One elections. And so it's an underlying problem in our elections that some of these disparities exist. And we found that ranked choice voting tends to kind of perpetuate those existing disparities, but not make them worse. And so overall, I think more voter education around elections and around how to fill out a ballot is really important. But ranked choice voting is not making these problems worse.
Let's move to counting. Because if I understand it correctly, there's really nothing that should make counting in ranked choice elections any slower, really, because computer systems can be set up to do it pretty darn quickly to go through those multiple rounds. But there's this perception, at least in some quarters, that it's a lot slower. And I'm wondering if that's more of implementation problem or a messaging problem or something. Can you talk about that a little bit?
You're absolutely right. There is no reason that inherently this needs to be slower. However, some places have chosen to make it slower. And I would stress that that's election administration decision. That's not something inherent to ranked choice voting. Most ranked choice locations release their, full results with their ranked choice tallies on election night or the day after. But a couple of high profile uses of ranked choice have waited a week or more before doing that like elimination and doing the runoff rounds. And so that's just a choice by administrators. New York City waits a week, and I don't think I'd like to see them count faster. I'd like to see them do it the next day, like most places do. Alaska waits 2 weeks, but they have some extenuating circumstances. You've got a lot of ballots coming in from rural parts of the state where they don't even have a tabulator in that area. And so the ballots are getting on a plane to get to a centralized location where they can all be tabulated. And that's going to be true in Alaska. That is not true in a place like New York City.
I think part of the problem as well, you mentioned a lack of trust and polarization, that when you see those round one sort of results published separately, almost inevitably someone will say, oh, yeah, well, look, and so, they were great in round one, and now all of a sudden they've just dropped. Boy, that sounds kind of hinky to me. And I think some people would say, well, regardless of the source or the reason why, it seems like ranked choice voting, while technically it might be superior, if people feel less secure about it and think it's just not as on the up and up, well, then that's actually not addressing the fundamental problem here. What do you think?
I think that's true. Our election systems, they only work if people continue to believe that they are accurate. I've been lucky enough in this job to work directly with election administrators, with their offices and with the individuals doing this work. And it's given me so much confidence that they have a lot on their plate and they take their jobs really seriously and they do a really good job. And so ranked choice voting does not change the fact that these folks are real professionals. But yeah, it's one extra step that they have to do. I think if you wait a long time before releasing the results, people start to ask questions. So go ahead and release them right away. I would contrast this with runoff elections. Think about Georgia's Senate runoff elections. It's like 3 or 4 weeks later. It's 3 or 4 weeks after the election. People go back to vote again. Well, okay, so people are waiting 3 or 4 weeks to know who won that race, but nobody complains if it's a come from behind win there. Ranked choice voting does the same thing, but voters don't have to go back and vote a second time. They already marked on their ballot. If my top choice doesn't make it to the runoff, between the finalists, who do I want my ballot to count for?
Now, as of now, I think there are only 2 states, Alaska and Maine, that have RCV for federal elections, and both of those happened relatively recently. But it seems like to me that while there was this movement to sort of expand RCV, there's been recently an even larger movement to restrict it. And it's now banned in, I believe, 17 states, with 6 of those bans coming in just this last year. And also in this last year, there were, if I'm counting correctly, 6 RCV initiatives in the states, all of which failed, and none of which, aside from the one in Montana, was particularly close. So that's a lot of pushback, and it seems to be pretty successful pushback, including bans in states that didn't even use RCV at the time the ban was put into place. So what's behind this, would you say?
So every state that has banned ranked choice voting were places where no cities or the state was not using it. So they banned absolutely nothing. In the places where some voters already were using it, they created carve-outs for those voters. So they changed absolutely nothing. I would call this political theater instead of substantive policymaking. Voters might be asking why their legislators are spending time banning something that's not even in their state. But this is kind of a top-down push. Ranked choice voting itself is nonpartisan. This is just a tool. It's a tool that voters can use, that parties can use, that any groups can use. But it's gotten a bit of a lefty reputation recently, which I think is misplaced, because some of the places that adopted it first were bluer cities. And I think folks characterizing it as a lefty reform, I think they have it wrong, because I think different sides have a lot to gain from this. It doesn't favor one party over the other. But right now, we're in a national environment where the Republican National Committee has come out against ranked choice voting, and groups on the right, like ALEC and the Heritage Foundation, have come out against this. And so legislators in red states are getting pressure to take a stance on this and to ban it, even when it's not being used at all in their state. I think it's going to turn out to be a mistake because, again, this is a tool. Republicans have benefited from ranked choice voting a lot in places where, say, the party has used it to nominate strong candidates from a divisive primary. And so they're throwing out one of the tools in their toolbox that really might come in handy in the future and that they might regret it.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold! Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
Gatorade is the #1 proven electrolyte blend designed to hydrate better than water. So you can lose more sweat and raise your game. Gatorade, is it in you?
Now, because you mentioned, I think all of the states, all those 17 states that have banned RCV are in fact Republican dominated. And it occurs to me that, well, one argument that maybe you could make, they wouldn't make this publicly certainly, is that, well, at present, the Republican Party is more extremist dominated than the Democratic Party. Now, some listeners might say, oh my God, that's totally wrong, but just hang with me here. If that's true, and if it's true also, that some people argue that RCV actually helps to minimize extremism by making it possible for more moderate candidates to get a foothold. And I'm not entirely convinced about that, but I'll let you speak to that. Then you could say, well, okay, then this actually would, at least in the short term, help a more moderate party more than it would help a more extreme dominated party. But I'm not even sure that that fundamental logic about RCV being good for moderation is necessarily true. I know that's a conventional wisdom, but I've also seen some studies or some research that maybe has called that into question. Can you kind of I know I threw a lot at you there. Take whatever you want, but can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think people can win ranked choice voting elections from all different parts of the ideological spectrum. You know, if you put this in place in a purple state, then you probably will get more moderate candidates who kind of reflect that state's purpleness. But when you put this into a blue city, you're going to get liberals, you're going to get progressives. If you put this into red cities, like a number of cities in Utah used this for mayor and city council elections, they're electing strong conservatives. I think in Alaska, we did see a couple of instances where more moderate Republicans won out over more extreme Republicans. I think Lisa Murkowski is one example of that. You know, she's known as one of the members of the Senate who's willing to be bipartisan, sometimes willing to buck her party on some issues. And so she had a challenger to the right, a Republican who was more conservative, and Murkowski won out. I think ranked choice voting was a really big part of that. And so, you know, I think it can create a divide within parties when something like that happens. But look, it's not about a specific ideology. It's about how you campaign and what kind of jurisdiction you're in. Candidates do best in ranked choice when they can build a broad base of support. If all you can do is target one narrow base, get, 30% of people who love you and 70% really don't like you, that's not going to be good enough anymore.
And let's talk about cost for a minute, because as I hope people know, it's not like there are these big kind of Scrooge McDuck piles of money for election administration just sort of hanging around in the states, right? And what's involved in terms of costs, in terms of resources of moving from a traditional system to an RCV system, both in terms of, there are changes obviously in tabulating votes, but also training folks and that sort of thing. I mean, we've had 2 states who recently have kind of gone through that change. What do we know about costs of RCV compared to traditional choose one?
The biggest cost tends to be voter education, because you want voters to feel empowered. You want people to walk into the voting booth, get a copy of this ballot, look at it and go, oh yeah, I knew this was coming. I've seen this before, rather than someone to walk in and go, oh, I panicked. This looks different, right? So this voter education tends to be the biggest cost. Luckily, time has really been on our side in the hardware and software challenges. 10 or 15 years ago, a lot of places couldn't do ranked choice unless they upgraded their machines. But today, almost everywhere is using machines that are ranked choice compatible. All of the hardware and software from the major vendors in the US, anything manufactured in the last 15 years, it can do ranked choice voting. That includes like ballot design and tabulation of the ballots. And, if you're using equipment that's 20 years old or more, maybe you'll need to upgrade that equipment, but that stuff was slated for upgrade anyway. And so the cost tends to be voter education. We love it when a place passes ranked choice voting along with a package to the election administrators, and sometimes with re-granting to community organizations. Say, get out in your community, show a picture of a ballot, say, this is what it's going to look like. This is a little bit different. Here's how you rank.
And so presumably most of those costs would be both upfront and short term, in that as voters go through an election cycle or two with ranked choice voting, they get more comfortable. And I guess you probably have data from Alaska and Maine maybe to that, even though it hasn't been that long, we would expect those costs to diminish over time.
Absolutely. Yeah. Almost all of that is an upfront cost. But elections need a little more funding in general. So I'll just do a general plug here for election funding. We've got a lot of outdated election infrastructure, and most of our election offices are understaffed. So they could use some upgrades and some more staffing. So in general, we ought to be spending a little bit more to make sure that our elections are, free and fair.
Yeah, that just drives me nuts. That people screaming about how we're concerned about the integrity of elections, and yet no one wants to spend any kind of real money to make sure that we're using the best possible equipment and giving people the best training. Anyway, it's just, I'll get off my soapbox and move on, but I'm sure you
I'm with you. I'm up there with you.
So I want to move off of RCV a little bit and talk about another big deal, at least for FairVote, and that's the Fair Representation Act. Can you talk a little about what that is, what the main components of that are?
The Fair Representation Act is a bill that was just reintroduced this past week in Congress. And so this would overhaul the way that we elect the House of Representatives. So it does ranked choice voting, but it goes further than that. Right now we elect the House. There are 435 seats, and each person is elected from one district. So 435 districts to elect 435 people. The Fair Representation Act would change that. It would make them multi-winner districts. So make each district bigger and have it elect multiple people. I use Massachusetts as an example. I used to live up there. They have 9 representatives from 9 districts. We're saying make it 3 bigger districts that elect 3 each. So they keep the same total number, 9, but they're elected from these multi-member districts. And when you use ranked choice voting to elect multiple people, it's a form of proportional representation. So what that means is if your district is about 60% Democrat, then you're likely to fill about 60% of the seats with Democrats. And that is a heck of a lot more fair than what we're doing now.
Yeah. And of course, again, it works both ways, whether it's Democrats or Republicans. Now,
absolutely.
Some people might say, well, with a system like that, isn't there a possibility for confusion? Because right now, I know I am in the Ohio's 1st district, and that Greg Landsman is my representative, and that's all I need to know. I'm good to go. But if it's 3 people, I'm like, well, who do I talk to? Who exactly is my representative? Is that a legitimate concern, do you think?
I think people will be a little better off if they're in a bigger district with more representatives. Right now, we have 70 million people that I call locked out of representation. That means they support one party, but they're in a congressional district that's totally safe for the other party. So they have no chance of sending someone to Congress who will advocate for their issues, who will even take their call. I'm sure a lot of listeners are going to be familiar with this problem that, if your representative is from the other party than you, they don't even want to hear from you. Call your member of Congress. They're not listening. They're listening to folks from their own party. And so that's true for 70 million people. Most of these, if you went to multi-member districts, they would elect members of both parties, also with space for independent and third-party candidates. And so a lot more people would have someone that actually represents them that they can call.
And I should point out that this is not some radical new experiment. I mean, in the early to mid 19th century, states with somewhere around a third of the U.S. population actually used multi-member districts. And if you even get more recently, the 88th Congress, which was 62 to 63, a number of states elected 22 House members from either multi-member district or at-large single-member districts. But what happened after that was the Uniform Congressional District Act of 1967, and that required single-member districts for all states with more than one House seat. And this idea was so popular, it actually passed both chambers with a voice vote. And this was in a very Democratic Congress. I mean, Democrats had a 61-seat margin in the House. We're up 28 in the Senate. So this was a clear, big, Democrats were for this, Republicans were for this. Why do you think there was such eagerness on both sides to ban multi-member districts if they have all these great advantages?
Well, you're right. We've got a long history with multi-member districts, but like almost anything else, you can do them in the good way or you can do them in the bad way. We used to do them in the bad way. So if you just have a district that's electing 5 people, well, I'm saying you should do that with some form of proportional representation. So you might get 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats, and it's about fair based on what people voted for. We used to do them in a way that whichever group is in the majority can have all 5 seats. So, if you're 60% Republican, then you would give all 5 seats to the Republicans and totally shut out the minority party. So this harmed the minority party, but it was also particularly bad for communities of color. This was sometimes used as a tool to ensure that a white majority could control 100% of the seats and avoid electing members preferred by voters of color. And so this became a voting rights issue because we were doing multi-member districts in a bad way. The Fair Representation Act ensures that when you're doing multi-member districts, you have to elect those people proportionally so that everybody gets their fair share.
And another component of this whole thing revolves around redistricting and gerrymandering. And so I wanted to make sure we talked about that as well. What would you say is wrong mainly with how most states currently do redistricting, and what would a better, or even, let's get all, utopian and ideal system for redistricting look like?
Well, it's a really timely week to be talking about this. We've got these gerrymandering wars going on.
Yeah.
Yeah. When we do redistricting, it becomes such a fraught process because if you change how you draw the line just a little bit, you can change the balance of power completely. I think we've all seen these kinds of maps and simulations where, in one state, the party in charge of redistricting can get themselves anywhere between 30% of the seats and 90% of the seats. And so the wars of this week, this was started by Texas Republicans thinking, oh, we might be able to get like 5 more seats. And they're right. You can draw a map to get yourself as many seats as you want. This is not good for voters. And then, when one party starts doing that, the other party wants to do it. And the incentives are really clear. The courts have decided that we are allowed to do this. Partisan gerrymandering is fine. Go for it. So of course, each side wants to do this. If we can get away from the single member districts, if we went to these multi-winner districts, then you really lessen the impact of gerrymandering. If you're drawing bigger districts and crucially electing people with proportional representation, it just doesn't matter so much how you draw the lines. There are a number of studies that show this. With multi-member districts, as long as you're electing people proportionally, basically any map will get you pretty close to fairness. Whereas in our current system, it's really easy to draw an unfair map.
Aren't we at least, it seems like some people might argue that we're making some progress on this. We've seen sort of a rise in so-called or ostensibly independent commissions, that sort of thing. And so that's maybe a positive thing. But on the other hand, I live in Ohio, and it seems like to me that the so-called independent, whatever system that we have for redistricting, it's really sort of a semi-sham, if you will. I won't get into the weeds on that, but how much of this reform and redistricting is real reform, and how much of it is just like a fig leaf that's just trying to cover what state legislatures and governors want to do with gerrymandering?
I do think that these independent redistricting commissions are helpful, but I see them as an intermediate step. They're like the short to medium term solution while we're working on fixing the bigger long-term problem. As long as we're stuck in single winner districts, whatever district you're in, I think you're in a district. I'm in DC, so I'm not. But however much, diversity of thought there is in your district, only one person represents that. Only one person is going to Congress, and, they'll represent the majority, but that can mean 40 to 49% of people are left out, no seat at the table at all. And that is what's leading to polarization. Even in a perfect map, if there was such a thing, you're leaving out a lot of people.
Well, it comes as no surprise, at least to listeners, that I'm for pretty much all this stuff. But the problem is, as I think you alluded to earlier, is this is so lefty coded, if you will, that it becomes really challenging to try to figure out how to go from saying, here are some great ideas, and here's why they're great ideas, and here's why they're actually nonpartisan, to convincing actual legislators to change the rules of the game. By the way, rules that they have learned and that they prosper by. They've won this game, right? They're elected, and they're probably going to get reelected with reelection rates being as they are. So to me, it seems like where the rubber meets the road isn't coming up with good ideas. I think we've got a lot of these good reform ideas in voting. But where I get stuck is trying to figure out a way to present this to folks as not an ideological thing, not some crazy stuff that we nutsy lefties have worked up to try to get socialists elected, but is something that's actually good for pretty much all Americans. So I'm sure you share that frustration. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we do get support from elected officials, which it shows that they're in there to be problem solvers, some of them, and then they're stuck, right? This gridlock is really frustrating to voters, but it's also frustrating to a lot of elected officials. They run on these campaign promises like, oh, I'm going to go work on this issue and that issue, and I'm going to clean up Washington. And then they get there and turns out they're stuck and they can't do very much. And so we work with a number of elected officials, it's the city level, state level, federal level, who want their elected bodies to be a little more functional. And so that's where we end up getting support for this. I think in other countries, when folks have moved from systems like ours to a proportional system, it tends to be when a party in power sees the writing on the wall that they might be about to lose power. They see, oh no, there's some big change coming. And if we get a proportional system, we could have 40% of the power. If we don't change the system, we'll have 0% of the power. And that's the impetus for making the change. And so right now, this means building support, showing that this works, getting working models of this in cities and in states. And so kind of being ready. So this solution is on the table, and kind of bringing Congress along with us, showing this can be done. This can work in the United States. When the moment is ready, we're ready.
So it seems like in general, when we move down to a local level, things tend to get at least somewhat less partisan, somewhat less ideological. And I guess if there's a way forward, then it sounds like the way forward is to kind of maybe build from there and then use the familiarity and success at that level to kind of, level it up to statewide and then maybe federal elections. Is that kind of like a reasonable strategy, you think?
Well, I sure hope so. Yeah, that is a big part of FairVote strategy, This idea that you go from the local level to the state level to federal. Congress is not going to act on this until we have some evidence to show how it's working in our country. There are other countries around the world that do this, but we need to see it working here for American voters. And so that's a big part of what we're doing, continuing to demonstrate how well this works in cities and in states.
And so what's the data from the two states that we have now that have actually used this for federal election, Maine and Alaska? When you talk to voters and when you look at the research, I mean, are voters happier with this than they were with the previous system? Has there been enough time for the initial confusion to kind of shake out, or what do you think?
Yes, voters say that they like this. Everywhere that it's used, voters like it and they want to keep it. They say they like it better than their previous system. One of the challenges to expanding it is that voters who have not used it yet, they think, oh, this sounds too new and different. But once someone has used it, they go, oh yeah, I'm never going back. Interestingly, when I'm out talking to voters about this, people will tell me, oh, that sounds too confusing. And I'll show you how it works. And they go, no, I get it. But I don't think my friends and neighbors would understand this. I'm like, well, I just talked to all of your friends and neighbors. They said they understood it, but they said the same thing about you, right? We have this idea that this is too complicated, when in fact, this is as easy as, I've got my first choice and I've got my second choice. And so it's kind of getting over that information hump to say, oh, you've heard of this can work.
Now, there are some people who would say, well, this is all well and good, but there's a lot of moving parts and it's awfully complicated. And I've got a better, simpler solution. There's always some guy who says that, right? But one of these so-called better, simpler solution is that, some folks would say we never should have abandoned the original 1 to 30,000 ratio for House members and the size of districts, which not only allows for much more sort of personal representation in smaller districts, making it more likely that your vote's going to count, but it would also make partisan gerrymandering, I would think, of things being equal, a lot trickier. Now we probably wouldn't want to go to 1 in 30,000 again, because that would be a House over 11,000 members. But there have been proposals to expand the House. And in fact, we used to regularly do that after every census until the Reapportionment Act of 1929 fixed the number where we have it now at 435. And I'm wondering, do you think that was a good idea, or do you see advantages to letting the House grow as our population grows when we're talking about representation and people's votes counting?
This is not really an issue that FairVote has an official position on, but just in my personal capacity, I do think it's a good idea to let the House expand with population. When compared to other democracies around the world, we do have one of the worst ratios in terms of, number of constituents per elected official. I think it could help a lot to have that better ratio so that elected officials are kind of more responsive to their smaller set of constituents. And I think it would pair really nicely with the Fair Representation Act. Doing multi-member districts with proportional. Imagine if I were trying to sell that to Oklahoma Republicans. They have 5 districts. All 5 of their congresspeople are Republicans. And if I went in there and said, well, you probably 1 or 2 of those seats should be Democratic. So 2 of you are going to lose your seats. Uh-huh. No way. But if I could say, your state's going to go from 5 representatives to 8 representatives. So all 5 of you can keep your seats, but you might get some Democratic colleagues. All of a sudden that goes over a little easier.
We haven't yet talked about, I think, 2 election issues that really bother a bunch of people, and that's the Senate and the Electoral College. Now, well, of course, everyone knows that every state has 2 senators, and maybe back in the beginning, that wasn't that big of a deal because the gap between, say, Virginia and Rhode Island in terms of population, I think that's the largest and smallest, wasn't that huge. But now the gap between something like Delaware and California is enormous. And so you can make a really strong case that Californians are getting less representation in Congress based on population than they should. And then, of course, the Electoral College, which everyone's familiar with, where tiny states also get that advantage kind of tied into the Senate thing. So, I mean, we haven't really discussed that. It doesn't seem like a big part of what FairVote is into. But aren't these, these seem to me to be the problems, especially with the Electoral College, that really animate a lot of folks. And what do you think? Is there any possibility for change there? Or is this just so baked in that no one really expects these things to change?
Well, there's always a possibility for change, or I have to believe that because this is the career I've chosen. Sure, yeah. So let me keep believing that. But yeah, I think that, there are good reasons to want some reforms in those areas. I think, yes, the U.S. Senate is one of the more malapportioned bodies around the world, meaning that the members represent really different populations because our states differ so much in population. But there were good reasons we put this in place. It doesn't bother me so much that, okay, small states get representation too. Make sure small states don't get trampled. Great. What really bugs me is in the Electoral College, when all of these states are giving their electors winner take all. So, the problem is not that the California electors and the Wyoming electors represent different numbers of people. The problem is neither of those are swing states. California, they don't not matter because they're big. They don't matter because they're not a swing state, right? Only 10 states end up mattering. And so there are a lot of ways, I think, to fix the Electoral College problem, and a lot of ways that, in fact, are possible. And so, I love looking at the work of my colleagues in the reform space. A lot of people are working on these issues and trying to kind of bring these results closer to what people are asking for and make sure that voters aren't left behind.
Yeah, because I think a lot of people don't realize that there are actually different ways to apportion electors. In fact, Maine and Nebraska use a different way. And if, say, California and Texas and Florida and Ohio started doing that, well, then all of a sudden the entire landscape of presidential campaigning, I expect, could be decidedly different.
I think so. Yeah. I love the way Maine does these. They do their electors by congressional district, but then they also, they have a bonus. They give some of them out to the person who wins statewide. So it's like a nice bonus for the statewide winner. And I think states could all be doing this in kind of a proportional way. Each state gets to decide how to do this. But there is a question of, unilateral disarmament, right? What if some states started sharing their electors more evenly, but states on the other side of the political spectrum did not? Then all of a sudden you have one side giving up power. And so I think that it has to be kind of an agreement between states that folks are all doing this at the same time in order to not really just harm one side.
So when you look at what's going on just generally with voting and elections, what are the things that you see that just give you the greatest concern? You're like, oh man, that's just awful or really bad.
The increasing polarization really concerns me because it has gotten worse. I'm based here in DC. Folks who work on the Hill, it seems like every couple of years they're saying, oh yeah, this is the worst it's ever been. Yeah, even worse than when I said that 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Nobody is willing to work on the issues that we actually need to tackle because everyone is just hunkered down in their own corners. And we have to get out of this cycle. So that really concerns me.
And because I always want to end on an optimistic note, whenever possible, when you, again, look out over everything that's going on, what do you see that's happening or maybe developing and say, wow, that's a really positive sign?
There is so much energy for systems reform. And this is such a nerdy little thing, like, systemic reform. But everyone is talking about this now in a way that was not true 10 years ago. Our reform movement is full of people who used to work on other issues. And, they spent decades, years, they spent their career working on some other issue and never made any progress. And so now they're working on, we have to fix the system before we can tackle anything else. And so I think the reform movement is full of folks like that who are really energized about this. As the problem has gotten worse, these sort of fix the underlying systems and the underlying incentives has become popular. And so that's why we're seeing so much interest in proportional representation, in ranked choice voting, et cetera.
Well, I certainly am glad to see it because for decades now, I've been talking about the importance of this fundamental plumbing and these incentives. And it is good that there are groups like FairVote out there, people like you who are dedicated and optimistic and working hard to try to make this happen. And I certainly appreciate that. And I've very much enjoyed talking with you today, Deb.
Oh, well, thank you so much. It's been great to be here. Great to chat with you about all of this.
Thanks for listening to this Politics Guys interview. If you want to get in touch with us for any reason, you can do that in a bunch of ways. There's email, mail@politicsguys.com, as well as Facebook or X. Links for those are in the show notes. There's also our Discord discussion forums for supporters, which I am on all the time, probably too much. No. But anyway, if you're not already a supporter, I hope you'll consider becoming one. When you become a supporter, you not only help us continue the work that we're doing, but you get ad-free versions of everything we release, as well as the full-length midweek episode, as opposed to just that 15 or so minute preview. And if you'd like to get that full-length midweek episode, but you're not in a position to financially support us right now, not a problem. Send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get that set up for you. And whether you're a supporter or not, it really does help us out if you subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast app you use, as well as sharing episodes on social media. And finally, a very special thanks to our executive producers, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, and Brian Matza.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,